Good evening, students, families, teachers, and Pinellas County friends. Welcome to our Night at the Museum here as we review for our U.S. History EOC. My name is Jessica Hosla, the High School Social Studies Instructional Staff Developer, and I'm here with Rui Farias, who is the Executive Director of the St. Petersburg Museum of History. We're standing here in the museum tonight, standing in Little Cooperstown, the largest autographed collection of baseballs in the world. So what I'd like for us to give Rui a moment to tell us a little bit about the museum. So Rui, could you tell us a little bit about the museum?
Sure, thank you, Jessica. It's an honor and a pleasure for us to be here and be a part of the Pinellas County efforts in getting the kids ready for the U.S. History EOC. You're in the St. Pete Museum of History. It is the oldest museum in Pinellas County, one of the oldest in the state. Actually, next year we'll be celebrating our 100th birthday. So we've been here quite a long time, and sometimes I feel like I've been here as long as the museum has been open. But we are a museum that started off as a local St. Petersburg museum that has now grown to more of a regional and statewide learning facility. So our goal is to expand to include all the history of the state of Florida, and not just be a place where people can come see like amazing baseballs, a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy, and all kinds of the other great artifacts we have, but also come to learn about the unique history that our state has. And a lot of people don't realize the importance of Florida history and the growth of the United States and U.S. history, and hopefully we'll help them get there.
Well, thank you, Rui, for sharing all that your museum has to offer. Now, let's head on over to the main gallery, where we're going to go ahead and give you an overview of our content focus terms and topics that we're going to focus on in our short review tonight. For our scholars watching this evening, let's take a quick look at the benchmarks and topics we are here to focus on in this quick review. The first benchmark we're going to focus on is A5-4, which asks us to evaluate how the economic boom during the Roaring '20s changed consumers, businesses, manufacturing, and marketing practices. Along with that benchmark, our second one, A5-12, asks us to examine key events and people in Florida history as they relate to the U.S. history. And our third benchmark that we are going to focus on tonight asks us to analyze the influence that Hollywood, the Harlem Renaissance, fundamentalist movement, and Prohibition had in changing American society in the 1920s. These benchmarks do cover a lot of content, and I know we can't review everything in the time we have tonight, but some of the things we are going to review are the economic boom, bull market, speculation, installment buying, Florida land boom, Prohibition, and a little bit about the Jazz Age and Harlem Renaissance. While you're watching, if you do have a question during this live stream, you are able to submit questions that you have to the email address that you see on your screen. And that email address is pcssocial@pcsb.org. We won't be able to answer all the questions, but we'll pick a few to share. And remember, you can always ask your U.S. history teacher. So let's go ahead and turn to Rui. Rui, we're going to start with talking about the economic boom. So to help us understand and review the 1920s, let's start with national trends. What are we seeing in the nation? And look at the economic boom being experienced during this time period. So can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. After surviving World War I and living through the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, America was ready for something different, and really America was ready for two things. One was to have fun, right? And the other was to get rich and make money. Even President Coolidge at the time said the business of America is business. So American industry, when they switched back to peacetime industry from the wartime industry, started producing goods at an unprecedented rate. Record-breaking rate. And it was goods that people would use in their homes that they've never had before, like vacuum cleaners or washing machines along the way. More of America was getting electricity and they started producing these products that Americans started buying. And for the first time, products were actually easier to buy by Americans because of a thing called an installment plan. For the first time in U.S. history, America had a long tradition of saving and buying things when they had the money to buy it. But for the first time, using an installment plan, America fell into this buy now, pay later attitude. They started buying on credit. So it's almost like the birth of credit cards in the United States. America begins living beyond its means, and that really does come back to haunt us towards the end of the decade. But the way that these manufacturers, retailers, got the information out to the people to purchase these new products and these goods was pretty much the birth of modern day advertising. These were new methods of advertising, new mediums of advertising, because back in the day, you would hang your sign outside your store. It was Joe Smith's General Store, and people knew they could come in and buy what they needed to buy. But now, the advertising was more specific towards the products, and the mediums were new, like radio. Nearly every American home now was getting a radio. Magazines became more popular. Newspapers, although ever popular, now are carrying up to full-page ads selling products. So these retailers and these manufacturers were telling you what you needed, when you needed to buy, and how many you needed to buy along the way.
So Rui, at this time, speculation purchases became really popular. So can you explain how that worked and how that played out?
And this is also new for the general American public. People were buying products not to use or not to have in their home, but they were buying things from homes to property, you name it, for the effort to try and sell it later and hopefully make a profit. Speculation really took off when it dealt with the stock market. And the American public started looking at the stock market almost like people going to gamble at a casino, and they were taking their life savings and they were speculating that they would purchase these stocks and they'd be able to resell them at a much higher price later. This also led to buying on margin, which kind of ties into the whole buy now, pay later plan of America during this time period. It was you would buy stock in a down payment, and then you would pay for it later, hoping that you would sell it in the meantime, making a tidy profit. The whole attitude of America at that time was almost, they needed to live for that day rather than the plan for the future. After living through the war, and again, living through the pandemic of 1918. This leads to a bull market, which means there was heavy trading. People were buying more than they were selling. It caused a rise in prices. A lot of these inflated prices where the stocks were really not worth that much, but people were buying them anyway, hoping to sell them later as time went on. And Americans also started speculating on land. They looked to purchase land and hope to sell it for a profit later. When Henry Ford and his Model T became affordable for the average American to own, and roads were being built leading into the South, into Florida, especially as we look at this photo here, this is a great photo of African American laborers here in St. Petersburg clearing land for what is going to become the area of 4th Street and Gandy Boulevard. As the roads continued to come, people started heading to Florida. And they came for more than surf and sand and beaches. They came for the illusion of wealth. And the photos we're looking at now actually are two great photos of the construction of Gandy Bridge. So this shows you how they originally built the first Gandy Bridge.
Thank you, Rui, for sharing about economic boom and looking at that at the national level and a little bit about the state level. But I'd like to turn our attention now to Nevin Sittler, who is the museum curator of exhibits and also a historian.
Absolutely.
So my question to Nevin, we don't want to forget about Florida and us here in Pinellas County locally. So Rui mentioned speculating in land purchases. What did the Florida land boom look like?
Well, exactly as Rudy mentioned about speculators, they had the desire to increase their wealth. So we had a lot of fellows coming up from the north that were already kind of well off to begin with. They brought their money into St. Petersburg and into Florida with the hope of, exactly as Rudy had mentioned, buying a piece of property and then either developing it or selling it for a profit. In fact, you had a couple builders here. You had Perry Snell, Yeah, Charles Roser of the Roser fame. It's a great piece of local history that I'd love to share with you. You guys come and visit the museum. And then you also had a guy named Walter Fuller. Well, these guys built these lavish neighborhoods with beautiful, absolutely beautiful mansions, gorgeous homes and buildings that still exist today. But what they also did was increase the excitement. They sent out postcards enticing other Northerners to come to the area. They used kitschy little salesmen. They were called binder boys. They would walk around in their old knickers and their little jodhopper hats, whatever they were called, but they had binders full of homes and property that they were trying to lure other folks to get excited about. In fact, Perry Snell once bought, sold again the Janus block in St. Petersburg, and every time he bought and sold that property, he ended up increasing his wealth. So it was not uncommon at all to find wealthy Northerners chasing that dream. And in fact, there were so many Northerners coming to the area that, well, what do we need? We needed to house them. And within a few short years of the early 20s, several beautiful Mediterranean-style revived buildings or hotels were constructed in just a few years' time. But what it did was provide thousands of first-rate, first-class hotel rooms for these wealthy Northern visitors who are happy to spend their money and continue the speculation.
All right, so Rui, it would be really hard to talk about the 1920s and the Roaring '20s without talking about the Jazz Age. So we just focused on the economic boom, kind of what was going on around our country nationally and also in Florida. So Rui, could you give us a brief overview, actually starting with Prohibition and what was going on with the country and with Prohibition?
Well, you know, if in the 1920s, if everybody obeyed the laws in the 1920s, the Roaring '20s would never be roaring. It was a period of time where people wanted to enjoy themselves and have a good time, and this was a complete conflict with what was happening nationally when it came to laws. The temperance movement, which began in the 1800s, pretty much blamed the use of alcohol for all of America's problems. For people's poverty, for unemployment, for crime, and worked throughout the 19th century to try and have alcohol banned from towns, cities throughout the United States. Well, that finally came true with the 18th Amendment, which led to Prohibition. This was an American experiment under the Volstead Act to outlaw the manufacturing, the transportation, and the sale of alcoholic beverages. They didn't outlaw the consumption of it, but if you can't make it, move it, or sell it, how are you going to drink it? So America took this huge conservative turn there at the national level and created these laws basically banning alcohol. The problem is it was never going to work. Americans liked their drink. But more importantly, there was never going to be enough law enforcement to actually enforce these laws. It was nearly impossible along the way. Bootleggers began smuggling booze in from Canada, from Cuba, and from Mexico, and people started making their own booze. There's bathtub gin in the New England area, and then there were stills throughout the South where people boiled corn, mostly to make whiskey or to make bourbon. And the photo we're looking at now on the screen is police officers here in St. Petersburg that have just confiscated a still down in the area that is now Lakewood Estates. So people had no problem making their own alcohol to enjoy along the way. And one of America's biggest pastimes now, NASCAR racing, actually got its birth from the gentleman who drove these cars. So they would produce this alcohol in these stills, or they would bring them in from Canada or from Cuba, and they would pack the alcohol in cases, and these guys drove these hopped up cars, and the sheriffs would chase them. And when the France family decided to create this thing called NASCAR, that's where they turned first for their drivers along the way. Americans also flocked to speakeasies. These are illegal secret bars. Most of them you had to have a secret password or a secret knock, or they'd slide. You see in the movies, they slide open the little window and they ask you what the password is along the way. And they were pretty much built anywhere that you could put a bar along the way. And a lot of these bars received their product because the one thing that Prohibition did do in the United States is that it helped the rise of organized crime in America. The alcohol had to come from somewhere, and these organized crime families throughout the United States, who at this time their main areas of income were gambling and prostitution and loan sharking, had no problem supplying America with all the alcohol that it needed to drink. And these crime families came from everywhere, and of course the most famous of all is Al Capone out of Chicago. And the photo we're looking at right now actually is Al Capone. He's the second one from the right there, when he was in Florida. He loved vacationing in Florida and eventually moved to Florida as his permanent residence.
So thank you, Rui, for sharing the details about Prohibition. Along with Prohibition, we can't forget the Jazz Age. So the 1920s also brought about the Jazz Age that included the Harlem Renaissance and the influence there. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, we can thank F. Scott Fitzgerald for its name, for the Jazz Age, which and really that is probably the best name you can have for this era. It just resonates fun, going out, dancing, partying, and that was the Jazz Age. The 19th Amendment, when the 19th Amendment was passed and gave women the right to vote, a lot of other freedoms followed for women at that time, and this helped fuel the Jazz Age, because prior to this it was rare that you would see women going to bars or drinking establishments or dance halls. This changed in the 1920s. This changed during the Jazz Age. Women changed their dress, their attitude. They went from Victorian dress of being covered from neck to ankle to the flapper age of the 1920s. But one of the most amazing things actually to come out of the Jazz Age is the Harlem Renaissance. And the jazz music itself, which originated in New Orleans and it's made its way up north, really found a national spotlight in Harlem, which is primarily an African American neighborhood in New York City. And the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s becomes this explosion of African American art, music, written word that came out of that area and gave us people like poet Langston Hughes, author Zora Neale Hurston, jazz great Louis Armstrong. There's a photo of Louis Armstrong there. Band leaders like Duke Ellington. This is the first time that African American art, literature, music really did get its spot on the national stage along the way. And the most famous spot of all in Harlem at this time was the Cotton Club. This was a nightclub that became the jazz mecca of the world. And it was also the starting point of what becomes known as the Chitlin Circuit. These were venues that stretched from New York all the way down to Florida into St. Petersburg and onto Miami, that catered to African American audiences. Because when these amazing artists like Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong, these folks would come primarily down to the South, and when they came to places like St. Petersburg in the 1920s, they played at the Coliseum. The Coliseum, when it opened, was known as the finest dance hall in the South. It was built as a big band dance era building. And you're having a great look at it there now. When it first opened, you can see how it actually looked. The problem was in the 1920s, when these artists came down from Harlem, from the Cotton Club to perform here in places like St. Petersburg, this was the era of Jim Crow, and this was the era of segregation. The black residents of St. Petersburg who moved to this city in mass after the arrival of the railroad weren't allowed, because of laws and customs, to go to the Coliseum to actually see these artists perform. So after playing at the Coliseum, a lot of these artists, when they played at the Coliseum for their white audiences, a lot of these artists would pack up the bus or pack up the cars, and they would head to 22nd Street South, where they would look to perform for the black neighborhoods. And Nevin, we've talked about this, that a lot of these that whole area of 22nd Street South was just an amazing place in the 1920s for African American culture in St. Petersburg.
Essentially, it's the heart of the black community at the time. And luckily, we had an African American businessman and leader by the name of Elder Jordan that ended up building a beautiful dance hall named the Manhattan Casino. And as Rui mentioned, after these jazz legends, we've got Ella Fitzgerald, Ray Charles, Buster Cooper. You've got all these great legends that have played for the white-only audience at the Coliseum. Like he mentioned, they'd pack up and they'd go a few blocks south and they would play at the Manhattan Casino for their black audiences. And it was a huge success. The success of the Manhattan lasted for quite a while, then some economic decline, but nonetheless, there's a new revival of that area in the Manhattan. Hopefully, you're going to see it coming back, and I implore you to explore that area.
Thank you, Nevin,
You're very
for
welcome.
giving us some of that Florida background. What I'd like for us to do now is turn our attention over here to Jesse Breckenridge. Jesse is the Museum Archives and Collections Manager. And I'm going to first ask Jesse to tell us a little bit about what we're standing in front here and how that relates to Florida and locally here in Pinellas County.
Yeah, so this dishware that we have in this case is just one example of the kind of wealth that St. Pete museums had in the 1920s. A majority of the higher dollar hotels would send out and have their dishware done by famous ceramics companies. This plate here, the mermaid plate, is one of the first that the Vinoy ran, and it is, in fact, very rare.
All right, thank you, Jesse, for sharing about.
And plus, they're fun and they're whimsical, and they, as you mentioned, they showed the wealth that these hotels were presenting. Mm-hmm. You had the Vinoy and the Sereno and the gorgeous Don Cesar having flatware just like this to entice those customers to extol the virtues of not only the hotel but of the area and send it on in postcards and notes back up north.
And that was part of the actual, the whole plan, the whole marketing plan, the advertising plan to bring people here. Is the intention was to bring down people of wealth, mm-hmm. To stay here, to visit here, to purchase land here. I mean, people like, F. Scott Fitzgerald stayed, at the Don Cesar. The famous athletes like Babe Ruth and the folks that came through stayed at the Don.
You even had, Henry Ford, and
Right.
you had Thomas Edison, two great men that built huge winter estates in nearby Fort Myers. So that, again, is just more proof of those wealthy Northerners want to come to this beautiful weather and make money.
Right, and the hotels had to cater to that. I mean, when you look at some of these photographs and some of the artifacts that we have here in the museum, what these hotels had to offer in the 1920s, they had to provide what these guests would expect staying in the finer hotels of New York or Baltimore or Philadelphia. And some of the hotels that were built starting on the East Coast with Flagler and definitely on the West Coast with some of our great hotels in the 20s, they were known as some of the finest hotels in the nation during that time in the 1920s.
All right, so shifting over back over to Jesse. Jesse, could you share a little bit about the additional artifacts that we have over on the table for us?
Yeah, so we have some objects that come to us from the Manhattan Casino. We have Buster Cooper's trombone here. Buster Cooper was a St. Pete local who was known not only to perform in places like the Coliseum, but in the Manhattan Casino as well. And here we have some articles from Rosalie Peck, who was she was a teacher at Gibbs High, and in 1947 and 48 she was crowned the Queen of the Manhattan Casino, as she was quite a fixture there.
About the girls.
So we'd also like to introduce two students from St. Pete High School. We have Audrey and Elizabetta. Jesse, will you explain a little bit about what they're wearing tonight?
Yeah, so these are two dresses from the 1920s, and you can see sort of the shift from your traditional Victorian dress to dresses that have a dropped waistline and have this very tubular chemise look to them. And additionally, the hemlines rose as well. And this was due to a desire to dress more simply in a way that allowed you to have a bit more fun.
Well, thank you for sharing the exciting artifacts we have here, and thank you for dressing for us tonight. We appreciate that. Thank you, Nevin and Rui, for helping us learn a little bit more about the economic boom and the jazz age at the national level, but also here in Florida and locally in Pinellas County. So I know we've received some questions from those of you watching, so let's go ahead and try to answer a few. Remember, again, if your questions don't get answered, you can always ask your history teacher. All right, so Rui, first question that we received. So first question says, when did the land boom in Florida slow down or end?
That's a great question, because everything we've talked about has been about the craziness, the explosion of growth economically throughout the nation and in Florida itself. And it's incredible to think that, like in St. Petersburg, for instance, the growth that we experienced started after World War I, but really exploded in 1921-22, and pretty much started coming to a halt in 1926. A number of things happened. A lot of areas were overbuilt. People were producing or building more homes than they could sell. A hurricane that ravaged Florida prevented building materials from getting to Florida, so that was also an issue. And people just started turning their financial attention somewhere else. When the housing boom finally collapsed, people talk about the Great Depression, which comes at the end of this decade. The Great Depression in Florida starts much earlier than the stock market crashing, because once this land boom collapses, there's a tremendous amount of wealth that is lost in Florida. And one of our biggest developers, Walter Fuller, said it best in an interview with the Northern newspaper. He said that when he asked pretty much the same question about how has this Florida boom stopped, his response was, the supply of suckers has run out.
Wow, thank you, Rui. So our second question that we received, what was Florida's involvement with bootleggers and organized crime?
Well, this is the fun part of the 1920s to talk about when it comes to Florida. We had a lot of involvement. Cuba, obviously, being 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and Cuba at this time was the largest producer of rum in the world. So when Prohibition started, it made sense that the Cuban rum boats would make their way to Florida, and they had that help with organized crime. Families from New York moved to Tampa during this time period. And those families in Tampa pretty much controlled everything from gambling, especially the introduction of alcohol into Florida, from the Tampa Bay area as well as Miami. They controlled the entire state. And there's always these rumors that Walter Fuller, being the ever businessman, helped this matter because our very first nightclub in St. Petersburg was known as the Gangplank Lounge out in the Jungle Prada area, and everyone believes that nightclub was owned or partnered with Walter Fuller and Al Capone. Now, the city did actually find a tunnel that was buried from the dock area into what it was then the nightclub, but they didn't find anything fun in it, unfortunately. But we definitely played a large part in it, because the rum would come ashore, whether in St. Petersburg or Tampa or Miami, and then packed in planes and flown all over the country.
So to kind of go along with that same theme, our last question that we received was, did Al Capone really live here?
This is my favorite question. All right, so I have to say this in advance, so I apologize if anyone out there is a realtor. Because you hear this story a lot. If you're looking to buy an old house in St. Petersburg, either Babe Ruth or Al Capone lived in that house. Al Capone, like we said earlier, loved Florida. He vacationed here. He eventually moved here, buying a house in Miami. He did have business interests in St. Petersburg, and it is more than rumored that he did own property here along the way. A lot of his associates did live here. And he enjoyed the Florida sunshine like a lot of the other wealthy Northerners that came down in the 1920s.
Very interesting, Rui. Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and transition now to give you a chance as viewers to practice with some multiple choice EOC style questions. So you're going to see 4 multiple choice questions come up, and they're written in the style of the EOC exam. You will have about 30 seconds to answer each question, and then we'll go over the answer in between each. So let's go ahead and look at question number 1. So question number 1 asks, what was a major reason for the emergence of a consumer culture in the 1920s? Is it A, the federal government encouraged labor to unionize? B, enforcement of antitrust laws resulted in higher prices? C, minimum wage laws expanded buying power? Or D, advertising and installment plans payments encouraged buying? So let's take a look at what our correct answer is. Our correct answer is D, advertising and installment payments encourage buying. So I'm going to turn to Rui really briefly. Rui, can you explain to us why that is the correct answer?
Well, this relates back to the attitude of America in the 1920s that you can buy now and pay later. The fact that you could buy a home or a car or a radio, for that matter, in installment plans. And the reason why you knew about those things was because of advertising. So it's the birth of modern advertising, where the retailers and the manufacturers did an amazing job selling their product to the consumers.
Well, they told you what to wear, what to buy.
They did.
I mean, it was just a great concept. Early advertising is a fantastic story unto itself.
All right, thank you. Let's go ahead and go to our second question. Our second question is, what caused the economic boom and the financial speculation of the 1920s? So is it A, installment buying and an unregulated stock market? B, the expansion of civil rights to women and minorities? C, the mobilization of the economy for war? Or D, increased government restrictions on big businesses? Let's take a look at our correct answer for question number 2. Our correct answer is installment buying and unregulated stock market. So Rui, could you tell us why installment buying and unregulated stock market is the correct answer?
Well, especially with the stock market, I mean, there were no rules. Stock brokers, ran wild selling stock to people who couldn't afford it, really, and that became a huge problem later on. But with the idea of buying on margin, which allowed you to do that, or even installment buying when it came to other products that you would purchase, again, America wasn't worried about today. They could always make more money tomorrow to pay for what they purchased today.
All right, thank you, Rui. Let's go ahead and turn our attention to number 3. Number 3 asks, which of the following statements is true of Prohibition? A, it practically ended the use of alcohol in the United States during the 1920s. B, crime dropped significantly during Prohibition. C, people still consumed alcohol, but they would only drink in the privacy of their own homes. Or D, organized crime flourished during Prohibition. All right, looking at the correct answer, our correct answer is D, organized crime flourished during Prohibition. Rui, could you tell us really briefly
Sure.
why that is the correct answer?
All you got to remember when it comes to that is Al Capone. Very few people knew of Al Capone before Prohibition. Very few people knew of organized crime leaders or organized crime before Prohibition. That's the easiest way to remember it, that they needed to provide alcohol for the American public, and they provided the product that people wanted.
All right, thank you. And our fourth and final question, why are the 1920s sometimes called the Roaring Twenties? A, foreign trade prospered after World War I. B, the United States assumed a leadership role in world affairs. C, political reforms made government more democratic. And D, widespread social and economic change occurred. All right, and we see our correct answer is D, widespread social and economic change occurred. Rui, can you briefly share with us why that is the correct answer?
Absolutely, because America took the attitude of you only live once. After World War I, after the Spanish flu pandemic that killed millions of people around the world, they just discovered freedoms that they never had before, especially with women, with the right to vote.
All right, thank you. So with our practice over and the conclusion of our review session tonight, I want to remind all of our U.S. history scholars watching that you can continue your review, and we challenge you to continue your review using the U.S. History Review Center in SharePoint. And you can access the Review Center through Clever using your normal student login credentials. And then you're going to look for the High School Enrichment app or icon. Once you click on that, you're going to get to a page that shows links of the different subject areas. You want to click on Social Studies. And within that page, there are over 65 review tutorials and videos for content covered throughout the year. There's also EOC review practice tests and vocabulary activities that cover everything you've learned throughout the whole course of the year. So with that, I want to thank Rui and Nevin and Jesse, and also our guest students today for helping us review for our U.S. History EOC. Don't forget, our next event, live event, is next Wednesday, April 28th, and we are going to be live from the Florida Holocaust Museum. We will be reviewing a number of crucial events and pieces of information related to the Holocaust. Thank you all for joining us, and good luck as you continue preparing for the EOC.